I didn't discover my husband's second marriage through suspicion, late-night arguments, or a woman knocking on my door. I found out because of a form. A clean, official envelope delivered on a quiet Monday morning, the kind of mail you open without thinking because nothing in your life has ever required you to be afraid of paperwork. My name is Alina Whitman. I'm 60 years old, and I've lived in Madison, Wisconsin for most of my adult life. For 36 years, I believed my marriage was unremarkable in the best way, steady, predictable, built on shared routines rather than grand gestures. My husband, Robert, was the kind of man people trusted instinctively. Soft-spoken, reliable. The man neighbors asked to watch their house keys. The man coworkers described as solid. That envelope was addressed to Mrs. Alina Whitman. Correct address, correct spelling, correct everything. Inside was a pension benefits update referencing a spouse I didn't recognize, another woman listed as a legal wife, residing in another state, attached to the same social security number I had memorized by heart. At first, my brain rejected the information entirely. I assumed clerical error, duplicate records, government incompetence, anything except the truth standing quietly in black ink. But as I sat there at my kitchen table, sunlight hitting the same wood where I'd planned holidays and paid bills for decades, a realization settled in with unsettling calm. Mistakes are usually messy. This wasn't messy. It was precise, intentional, carefully maintained over years. And in that moment, before anger, before grief, before even disbelief, one thought rose above all others. If my husband had built an entire second life without me knowing, then everything I thought I understood about my own life needed to be re-examined from the beginning. For the rest of that day, I moved through the house on instinct alone, performing familiar motions while my mind worked somewhere far beneath the surface. I washed a mug I hadn't finished using. I folded a dish towel that didn't need folding. I checked the front window twice, half expecting Robert's car to pull into the driveway early, as if his presence might somehow rearrange the facts printed on that paper. It didn't. The document stayed on the table where I'd left it, uncreased, undeniable. When I finally sat down again, I read it slowly, line by line, the way I used to read contracts at work when something didn't sit right. Dates, employer names, contribution summaries, and always that same unfamiliar name appearing where mine should have been listed alone, not as an emergency contact, not as a beneficiary, but as a spouse, a wife. I thought back over the years and felt memories shift, subtle details rearranging themselves into something more coherent and far more disturbing. His frequent work trips to Illinois. The apartment he claimed his company rented for convenience. The separate bank account he'd insisted was just for expenses. Even the way he'd grown protective of his phone, angling the screen away from me not with secrecy, but with the casual confidence of someone who never expected to be questioned. I realized then that this wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was a sustained one, maintained through routine, patience, and my own trust. And what unsettled me most wasn't the existence of another woman. It was the discipline it must have taken to keep two lives running parallel for so long. That kind of deception doesn't rely on passion. It relies on control. I did confront Robert that night, even when he came home later than usual, loosening his tie and asking what was for dinner in the same unremarkable tone he'd used for decades. I watched him instead. Watched how easily he stepped back into the rhythms of our life, how naturally he occupied space that now felt slightly misaligned, like a picture hung just a fraction too crooked to ignore once you've noticed it. We ate together. We talked about ordinary things, the weather turning, a neighbor's renovation, a story he'd read online. And all the while, I studied the man across from me with a clarity I'd never allowed myself before. There was no guilt in his face, no tension in his posture. That told me everything. Whatever life he lived elsewhere didn't intrude here because he didn't see it as intrusion. He saw it as organization, compartmentalization. When he mentioned another upcoming trip, something about a project deadline, I nodded automatically, the way I always had, but inside my mind began constructing a different kind of timeline. One that didn't center his explanations but his absences. One that asked not why he went, but how he sustained it, financially, legally, emotionally. After dinner, he fell asleep in his chair, the television still murmuring to itself. I sat across from him and felt something unexpected take hold. Not heartbreak, not rage, but distance. A quiet detachment that allowed me to see the situation not as a wife betrayed, but as a woman observing a system that had been running without her consent. That was the moment I understood something crucial. If Robert had managed to maintain 2 marriages without collapsing under the weight of lies, then he had made one fatal assumption, that I would respond emotionally, impulsively, predictably. And as I watched him sleep, unaware that his careful balance had already begun to shift, I knew I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. The following morning, after Robert left for work with his usual kiss on my cheek, I sat down at my desk and did something I hadn't done in years. I audited my own life. Not just finances, not just schedules, but access. Who knew what? Who controlled what? Which accounts were joint, which weren't, and more importantly, who had the authority to change them without my consent. I pulled old statements from files I hadn't opened in a decade, tracing patterns that suddenly felt obvious. Transfers that coincided with his trips, contributions that didn't align with his reported income, small inconsistencies I had once brushed aside as normal fluctuations. I logged into every account I had access to, changed passwords, enabled alerts, and printed copies of documents I knew could be quietly altered if I waited too long. I didn't do this in a rush. I did it with precision, taking breaks, making notes, allowing the picture to emerge in full. By noon, I understood that Robert hadn't just divided his time, he had divided his identity. Separate insurance policies, different emergency contacts, carefully staggered beneficiaries. The sophistication of it would have impressed me once. Now it simply confirmed what kind of man I was married to. Still, I felt no urge to expose him yet. Exposure is noisy, and noise alerts people to adjust their defenses. I wasn't interested in adjustment. I was interested in truth, in leverage. In understanding how deeply he'd entangled 2 lives, and where those threads crossed in ways he couldn't control. And as I organized my findings into a folder labeled simply records, I felt a calm certainty settle in. Whatever he thought he was managing, whatever balance he believed he'd achieved, he had done so without accounting for the moment when the woman he trusted to stay unaware decided to pay attention. By the 3rd day, I stopped reacting and started observing, and there is a profound difference between the two. Reaction is emotional, observation is surgical. I began to notice how Robert spoke when he thought he was being careful, how his sentences curved around the truth without ever touching it, how he volunteered unnecessary details as decoys, how he asked questions that were really inspections disguised as concern. Did you go out today? Meant were you anywhere near the places I don't want you to see? You seem tired meant are you thinking too much? I answered lightly, predictably, giving him nothing new to measure. Meanwhile, I widened my quiet investigation. I didn't stalk or spy. I reconstructed. I reviewed old calendars, synced timestamps, compared credit card receipts with claimed meetings, mapped patterns the way analysts do, not to accuse, but to understand behavior over time. That's when I realized the second marriage wasn't an impulse or an affair that got out of hand. It was structured, planned, maintained with discipline. He hadn't fallen into a second life. He had engineered it. And that knowledge did something unexpected. It stripped the pain of its chaos. This wasn't about me lacking something or failing to see the signs. This was about a man who believed control was the same as intelligence and secrecy was the same as power. He believed he was the only one capable of holding multiple truths without consequence. What he didn't understand was that once you see the full structure, once you understand how carefully something is built, you also understand exactly where it can be taken apart, quietly, legally, and in a way that leaves no room for revisionist storytelling. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was planning clarity. And clarity, I was learning, is far more dangerous than anger. What changed next wasn't my behavior toward Robert, but my behavior toward myself, and that shift was subtle enough that he didn't notice it at all. I stopped seeking reassurance, stopped asking questions whose answers I already knew, stopped filling silences with explanations meant to keep the peace. Instead, I redirected that energy inward toward preparation. I scheduled appointments under neutral names, financial consultations, legal reviews, a quiet meeting with an attorney who specialized not in dramatic divorces, but in asset protection and undisclosed liabilities. I didn't present myself as a betrayed wife. I presented myself as a woman seeking clarity before making decisions. That distinction mattered. I learned how marital assets are traced, how dual households leave financial fingerprints no matter how careful the spender believes himself to be, how omissions can be more damaging than lies when contracts and oaths are involved. At the same time, I strengthened my position socially, not by gossiping or hinting, but by re-anchoring myself in visibility, attending events alone, reconnecting with professional contacts, re-establishing a version of myself that existed independently of my marriage. Robert had grown comfortable with the idea that I was stationary while he moved between worlds. He didn't realize that the ground beneath him was no longer fixed, and the most dangerous part, for him, was that I was no longer motivated by exposure. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I was building an exit so clean, so well documented, that when the truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't explode. It would settle into court records, into quiet acknowledgments, into consequences that didn't require my voice to be raised at all. The confirmation came on a morning so ordinary it almost felt insulting. No confrontation, no dramatic discovery, just a name that appeared where it shouldn't have, embedded casually in a document Robert had forgotten to shred. A school enrollment form, folded once, tucked into the wrong folder. A child, not hypothetical, not planned, already here. The realization didn't break me, it clarified everything. Suddenly, the late nights had weight, the secrecy had structure, the emotional distance had a destination. This wasn't an affair drifting in moral ambiguity. This was a parallel life, complete with responsibilities he had chosen to honor elsewhere while performing loyalty at home. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time with that paper in my hands, not shaking, not crying, just absorbing the precision of it. He hadn't merely betrayed me emotionally, he had redistributed commitment without consent. And in doing so, he had underestimated the consequences of treating marriage like a flexible arrangement only one party knew about. From that moment on, every step I took was guided by restraint rather than rage. I didn't confront him when he walked in that evening, tired, casual, affectionate in the way men are when they believe nothing has changed. I smiled back. I asked about his day. I let him believe the world was still balanced exactly as he'd left it. But internally, a line had been crossed from uncertainty into evidence, and with evidence comes leverage. I began documenting, not obsessively, not emotionally, but methodically. Dates, transactions, inconsistencies. I didn't need to invent a narrative, he had already written it for me. All I had to do was wait until the timing would ensure that when the truth emerged, it would do so in a way that required no argument, no pleading, no explanation. The truth, I understood now, didn't need to be shouted to be devastating. It only needed to be positioned correctly. What surprised me most during those weeks wasn't how easy it was to pretend, but how invisible I suddenly became to him. Once you stop demanding honesty, some people stop even checking whether you're still paying attention. Robert grew careless in ways that only happen when someone feels secure in another person's silence. He took calls in the open. He left receipts where I could see them. He started referring to future plans that didn't include me, then correcting himself with a laugh, as if it were just a slip of the tongue. And I listened. I observed the way his tone changed when he spoke to her, softer, more intentional, as though he were careful with that life in a way he hadn't been with ours in years. It wasn't jealousy I felt, it was recognition. He had given away the version of himself that once belonged to me, and in its place, I was living with an echo. That understanding sharpened my focus. I met quietly with a lawyer who specialized in financial disclosures and marital fraud. A woman who didn't flinch when I laid out the facts without embellishment. She didn't ask how I felt. She asked what I wanted to protect. That distinction mattered. Together, we mapped out a strategy that didn't rely on confrontation but on timing, documentation, and control of information. Meanwhile, at home, I remained calm, consistent, unthreatening. I cooked. I listened. I asked questions that sounded like concern but functioned as confirmation. Each answer he gave added another brick to the structure I was building, one he couldn't see because he assumed I wasn't capable of construction anymore. There is a particular power in being underestimated, especially by someone who once believed they knew you completely. I didn't correct that assumption. I let it work in my favor. The moment everything shifted wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't happen during an argument or a tearful confession. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that would have blurred into memory if I hadn't been paying attention. Robert told me he'd be traveling for work again. Another conference, another hotel, another rehearsed explanation delivered with the confidence of someone who no longer feared being questioned. I smiled, wished him luck, and watched him pack a suitcase that no longer felt connected to me. As soon as the door closed behind him, I moved. Not in anger, not in haste, just with precision. I accessed the shared accounts, the business records, the property documents I had quietly duplicated weeks earlier. I met again with my attorney, this time finalizing filings that would lock certain assets the moment papers were served. I contacted the accountant Robert trusted blindly and requested a full audit under the guise of tax preparation. By the time he landed wherever he thought he was going, the ground beneath his double life was already shifting. What he didn't understand, what men like him rarely do, is that betrayal creates patterns, and patterns create predictability. He had built his secret life assuming I would either break down or lash out. Instead, I chose structure. When he returned, tired and distracted, he found nothing different on the surface. Dinner was ready. The house was quiet. I asked about his trip and listened with polite interest. But now I was no longer gathering information. I was waiting for the right moment to let truth arrive, not as an accusation, but as an unavoidable reality, one that would reach him from every direction at once, leaving no space to lie, no room to negotiate, and no illusion of control left to cling to. The end didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It came quietly, efficiently, the way consequences always do when they are prepared in advance. Robert learned about the frozen accounts from his bank, about the audit from his accountant, about the legal filings from a courier who handed him documents he couldn't charm his way out of. And finally, he learned about the second wife when I placed the marriage certificate on the kitchen table between us, not asking a single question, not seeking a single explanation. He tried to speak, to justify, to minimize, to turn betrayal into misunderstanding, but the moment for words had passed. I told him calmly that I already knew everything, that I had known longer than he imagined, and that the life he built in secret was now his alone to carry. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I stood up, took my coat, and walked out of the house I had once begged him to fight for, leaving behind a man who mistook silence for weakness and patience for blindness. Weeks later, as my new life took shape, clean, intentional, and mine, I understood the truth that had taken me years to learn. Revenge isn't destruction, it's clarity. It's choosing yourself so completely that the person who betrayed you no longer has a role in your story. And if you've ever been quietly replaced, lied to with confidence, or underestimated because you stayed calm, remember this: strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits, plans, and walks away without looking back.